that exist are appointed by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authority resists the ordinance of God, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister, an avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Therefore you must be subject, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience sake.
Good morning. We took some time this morning, as we always do on the first day of the week, to remember. Remember what's been done for us by God's one and only Son, by God Himself providing salvation for us. I just wanted to mention that this evening we're going to take some time to remember also. Remember this day and the significance of this day in the history of this nation. So we're not going to neglect that. We're not going to talk about it specifically this morning, but we're not going to neglect it. We'll deal with it this evening in the worship service. This morning I want to go back to the subject we had begun last week, and that is Christians and government. And last week we talked about Christians' responsibility to government, using Mark chapter 12 as our basis for that. Jesus' remarks regarding the paying of taxes. But in Romans 13, the Apostle Paul writes about something else. He writes about people's responsibility and relationship to government, combining both of those ideas, but especially our relationship. And that's what we're going to focus on today. He specifically addresses Christians here, obviously, the Christians at Rome, and us as Christians through the Word of God. But he addresses them on their role as dual citizens under both an earthly government and under God's authority as part of His spiritual kingdom. So let's begin with the points that Paul makes here regarding the Christian and government. First of all, government is ordained by God. Government was established. It was the authority for it comes from God. Paul says, "For there is no authority except from God, and the authorities that exist are appointed by God." Number two, government is meant to encourage proper conduct, but it's also to punish improper conduct. That's a responsibility of government. Third, government has a right to punish those who do evil and who violate laws. In fact, this is not only a right, it's actually an obligation of government. It's responsibility of government. In verse 4, Paul says, "For it, the government, is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil." Number 4, Christians, like every person, are to respect and obey the duly constituted government. Verse 5, "Therefore you must be subject not only because of wrath, not only because of the fear of punishment if you violate the law, but also for conscience sake." And when it comes to the Christian, that's where we ought to be. Not because we're violating law, not because we're going to be punished for doing something wrong, but we're doing it because it is the right thing to do. And certainly right in the sight of God. And then in verses 6 and 7, you find a fifth principle. We didn't have those verses read this morning, but let me read them now. The fifth principle is, beginning at verse 6, "For because of this," because of all the things that Paul's talked about up to this point, "you also pay taxes, for they are God's ministers, attending continually to this very thing. Render therefore to all their due, taxes to whom taxes are due, customs to whom customs, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." As Jesus taught, as He demonstrated in His own life and even in His death, Christians, his disciples, should obey. They should be obedient, loyal citizens within an earthly nation. And Paul elaborates upon that in discussing how Christians should live in God's as well as in Caesar's kingdom. As we in this lesson turn our attention to the Christian's relationship to government, we need to dissect what Paul says here in Romans chapter 13. We need to take it apart and look at the very specific points that he makes here. We did that in general just a moment ago. Let's go a little deeper now. He starts with a blanket statement in verse 1. Let every soul, every person, be subject to the governing authorities. Obviously, this was addressed first and foremost to Christians. That's to whom the letter was sent. But it is not limited to them. Paul broadened it out here. To whom does every soul refer? To whom does every person refer? Well, obviously, it's a statement of obedience that's meant to include everyone. That's the way the New International Version translates this particular line. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities. Yeah, Paul meant to include all citizens in this, all people living under a form of government. The principle of obedience applies to everyone, not just to Christians. We ought to take it to heart. We ought to understand it. We ought to do what is right. But it doesn't apply just to Christians. To be subject to someone, to be subject to something, in this case, the higher powers, as it says in the King James Version, is to respect as well as to recognize the authority that they have. A parallel is in God's spiritual kingdom. Remember, we're talking now about being a dual citizen. I'm a citizen of the United States of America. I'm a citizen of the state of Ohio. I'm a citizen of Stark County, Ohio. I'm a citizen of Canton, Ohio, within that Stark County. All of those things are true, but I'm also, as a Christian, you're also, as a Christian, a citizen of God's kingdom. That's our dual, our double citizenship. Well, there's a parallel to what Paul is saying here in regards to our obedience to government authority. Go back to Hebrews 13, verse 17. In the church, in God's kingdom, obey those who rule over you. Who's that? That's the eldership. The leaders in God's church. Obey those who have rule over you and be submissive. Submit to them. For they watch out for your souls as those who must give account. So there is a parallel here in our citizenship as Christians. We're to obey the proper government authorities, but we're also to obey authorities within the church as God has established them. And in each of those cases, whether we're talking about civil government or whether we're talking about the eldership of the church, in each of those cases, the goodness or faults of either one is not the issue. The goodness or the faults of either authority is not the issue. All are to be respected and obeyed when that obedience does not counter either conscience or God's will. Let's put that caveat, interject that qualifier in there. All are to be respected and obeyed when that obedience does not counter either conscience or God's will. Because why? Paul says it here in Romans 13, because the authorities that exist are appointed by God. Whether you're talking about the civil government or whether you're talking about the eldership, they are ordained, they are appointed by God. Jesus even made that reference to the Pharisees when he told people in his day, obey what because they have their position from God. Obey them, but don't imitate them. Listen to what they say, do what they say, but don't do as they do. That's what Jesus said about the Pharisees. God determined there must be government to maintain order among people. We talked a little bit about this last week. God determined that. Those who govern receive their right from God to do so. Therefore, every person has responsibility. to recognize the authority of government, and every person has the responsibility to obey such lawful authority, unless such obedience counters either one's conscience or the understood will of God. This raises an important question about the Christian's relationship to government. It's a very important point. Are we to obey the authorities simply because they say to do something? Is compliance absolute with no limitations? And the answer to that question is no, it is not. To say, as so many did, for example, after the Second World War, I was only following orders. You probably know what I'm talking about. When World War II was over and when the horrendous things that had happened were discovered, when the Holocaust was revealed, the fact that we don't know the exact number, 6 million, total of possibly 11 million people murdered, men, women, and children, for no other reason than who they were. And there were those involved in these actions at the direction of a government, at the direction of governmental authority. And the justification on the part of so many was, I was only doing what I was told. That's a reason why something occurs. It's not an excuse. It's a reason why it happened. It's not an excuse for doing something wrong. I just did what I was told. What they were told was wrong in the sight of God. What they were told was morally abhorrent. So it does not wash as an excuse. And we cannot use that justification either. Well, I was only following my orders. I was only following the authority. We're supposed to obey the government, correct? But there's a limit to that. There is a limit to that. Government deserves our obedience. Government deserves our loyalty. Government deserves our support when it demands that which is proper, not immoral. Remember, as Paul says, there is no authority except from God. God and His will are still supreme. God and His will still stand at the top of the order. The implication of Romans 13, verse 3, is that governors are conducting themselves in an upright, honorable way, and that they're seeking the good of their community. They're seeking the good of citizens. Look at verse 3 once again. Romans 13. For rulers are not a terror to good works. They're not supposed to be. Unfortunately, sometimes they are. But they're not supposed to be. But to evil. Do you want to be unafraid of the authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. But the reality is, that's the ideal. That's what God established. That's what Paul's talking about here. What did God establish? But the reality is that governments don't always act honorably. They don't always act for the welfare of their citizens. That's the reality of the situation. That's what we know. To be a good law-abiding citizen, though, generally, is to have no fear of the government. Every time you see a police car, are you afraid? Now, I know, I slow down, all right? That's an involuntary reaction, okay? You do too, so don't laugh. That's an involuntary thing. But I see a police car. I'm not in fear of the police. Why? I haven't done anything wrong. Now, could I still be stopped and wrongly charged? Well, I could. It not happen very often, but sometimes it does. My father experienced that years and years ago. He was driving somewhere in this area, I'm not quite sure where, He was pulled over by a policeman, ordered to get out of the car, put his hands on top of the car. He was frisked. He had no idea what was going on. It turned out, he then was told afterwards, there was a car that had been involved in the commission of a crime that was like the one he was driving. And until they could check out the license number and everything, and remember, this is about now 60 years ago. Communication was not quite as instantaneous as it is today. Until they could check it out, they weren't sure whether or not he might be the person they were looking for. He wasn't, and so everything was fine. Does it happen? Certainly it does. Why? Because we're not perfect. No individuals, no people are perfect. We make mistakes. But if we're not involved in criminal activity, we have no reason to fear the authorities. Those who fear the police should be those involved in doing something wrong. Yes, they should be wary about them. They should have concern about that. Paul says that those who do evil and who violate laws should have fear. That's verse 4. For he is God's minister to you for good. But if you do evil, be afraid. For he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is God's minister and avenger to execute wrath on him who practices evil. Government has the power to punish. Government has the right to punish. Paul says so here. And government has the reason to punish evil and evildoers. It does not bear the sword in vain. It is not meaningless. That punishment should not be meaningless. It has a purpose. Government authority should stand as a deterrent to those who would do evil toward their fellow citizens. But again, we know in the real world that doesn't always happen. There are still people who, for their own reasons, will commit crimes. But the punishment is supposed to have a purpose. It's supposed to have a legitimate reason behind it. Government has an obligation to protect citizens from those who practice evil. Where would we be? What kind of a situation would we have to live in if there was no such authority? Now, there are some people in recent times who've advocated that very thing. Get rid of the police. And they have their own agenda for doing that, their own agenda for calling for that. Where would we be without that kind of protection? I don't think we want to live in that kind of society, do we? We want to live in that kind of situation. But on the other hand, let's look at the other side of this now. We're talking about government having that right, government having that authority. Citizens, Christians, and everyone else are not so authorized. We do not have that authority. We cannot justifiably take the law into our own hands. That is not right. There are some people who have tried to justify their actions on the basis of morality. I haven't heard of any recently, but you and I both know there have been bombings of abortion clinics. And while I fully do not in any way agree with what was happening in those places, I also do not agree with someone taking that measure to stop it. Because that's taking the law into our own hands. And once again, let me ask the question, what kind of a culture, what kind of a society would we live in if everybody does that? We don't want to live in that kind of world, where lawlessness is the rule and flaunting government authority is the rule. So there are two sides to that. We don't want to live in an oppressive society, no. And many, many millions upon millions upon millions of people have over the centuries, over the history of the world, lived in very oppressive societies. We're very fortunate here in the United States of America to live in the greatest democracy. I know we were founded as a republic, but a democracy in the world. We're privileged in that way. But we have no right to take the law into our own hands, Christian or not. In the Christian's relationship to government, we're to submit. Paul says in verse 5, not only because of wrath, not only because of fear of punishment, fear of consequence, but also for conscience sake, just the idea of our relationship with God and what that means. Disobedience to the law should stir feelings of guilt. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, on the part of individuals. But it should stir feelings of guilt. And certainly in the mind of the Christian, it ought to stir feelings of guilt. We're supposed to be, again, law-abiding people. And this should serve as a motive for obedience. I love the story that Jerry Jones tells about once being traveling from a gospel meeting back home once again. He's traveling on an interstate highway. This is back in the days of CB radios. You young people probably don't even know what a CB radio is. But we had those at one time. And truckers commonly used them as they traveled from place to place. He was traveling along this highway. There was a trucker in front of him, a trucker behind him. And they were making pretty good time. And Jerry was kind of flowing right along with them. He said he was doing good too. He was on his way home. He was going to get home earlier than he thought he might. He was doing real well because they had his front door and his back door. And that's the old terminology. They're watching out for Smokey, the highway patrol. Because on their CBs, they would pick up these things. And so he said in the conversation he was having with these truckers about rolling along like that, there came a question at one point. One of the truckers asked him, by the way, what do you do for a living? And Jerry said, uh-oh. He'd been exceeding the speed limit somewhat in flowing along with these truckers. And so he said that was the end of his journey along that line. He kind of backed away from what he was doing. He realized what he was doing was not right. Even though it was gaining him time, it certainly was good for him and his travel, but he said, I realized something. I'd have to admit that as a Christian and as a Christian minister, I was participating in something that was entirely illegal. And so it affected his conscience on that score. Obedience to the governing authorities is obedience to God. That's what Paul says. It's obedience to God. The Christian's relationship to government is a part of his or her relationship to God. It's part of his or her relationship with God. The Christian's relationship to government also requires obedience in supporting it financially. We may fully disagree with policies regarding taxation. We may feel tax rates are excessive. We may even have serious reservations. We may certainly have objections as to how the government uses the revenue it collects. But none of these gives us the right to withhold that which we are lawfully required to provide. It doesn't give us the right to do that. We're to pay our taxes for the support of government. Now, how government officials use or how they misuse that money is their responsibility. Let me give you a parallel here. Think about it this way. God said to his people, to the church, give. That's a command. We're to give of that of which we have prospered. That's a command. There is an eldership that oversees the congregation. There is an eldership that oversees the work of the congregation. There's an eldership that oversees the finances of the congregation. you or I may have a real disagreement with how some things are being done. We may have a real disagreement with how money is being used. But if I say, or you say, I'm going to withhold my contribution because I don't agree with that, we are wrong. We are absolutely wrong. God said to me, and God said to all of us, give. Now, how they use those funds or misuse them is the responsibility of those who have the authority. Now, we can go to them and we can talk to them about it, but the idea of withholding your contribution because of that is not right, and withholding your taxes because you don't like the way the government spends the money or you don't like what they do with it, that is wrong. We must hold the authorities accountable. We have elections to do that. That's the process in this country, whereby we make it known we don't agree with what's going on. We don't agree with what's being done. We don't agree with the way things are being handled. That's how we do it. Or we change the laws. But we do not withhold that which is due. Jesus said, Paul says, you pay your taxes. They may be excessive. I wish they were none, truthfully. But that wouldn't work either. Government has to generate money somewhere. Government does not make anything. It does not generate anything. It has to receive what it spends. I wish government officials could come to that conclusion. Government doesn't produce anything, except possibly problems. No, I'm kidding when I say that. No, I'm not kidding when I say that. But we don't have a right to withhold that which is due. So altogether, Romans 13 tells us Christians are to support, they're to obey, they're to respect government and its agents. As citizens, we are to be law-abiding to the best of our ability. The only clear exception to this is when government requires of us something that God says is wrong. Then we must take the position of Peter in Acts 5, verse 29. We ought to obey God rather than men. But let me finish this morning with one other related topic, something about which there is a great deal of misunderstanding, a great deal of misinformation. A point of view espoused that is not in any way truthful. It deals with government's relationship to its citizens. We've been talking about responsibilities. We've been talking about relationship of ourselves to government. What about the other way around? What about government's relationship to its citizens? And what about the relationship between civil government and religious practices? This whole matter of church and state. You hear it so often. You hear it talked about so much. You hear it talked about in the wrong ways so much. And people misusing and misunderstanding what our founders, the men who wrote the Constitution of the United States, our governing document, and the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to that document, what they meant in this whole matter of religion. In 1791, 10 amendments were added to the new Constitution of the United States, which itself had been written at Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, ratified by the required number of states, put into effect in 1789. And now, 2 years after that, 10 amendments are added to the Constitution. Taken together, we call them the Bill of Rights. It wasn't by accident that this was done. Before states would agree to the new Constitution, there was an insistence that this be included, that there be a specific Bill of Rights. What was this Bill of Rights all about? It was about limiting the power of government over citizens. That's what the Bill of Rights is for, is to limit the power of government, specifically the central government. It does refer to the states in the last two amendments, but specifically the federal government, the national government, over its citizens. And the very first of those 10 amendments identifies 5 freedoms that the citizens of the United States were to perpetually have freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition the government for redress of grievances, freedom of the press, and the one that I've saved for number 5, but actually is number 1 on the list, and that is freedom of religion. The wording of the Constitution in Amendment 1 says this: Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Well, I was saying just a moment ago, it's limiting the power of the national government to control certain things. In this case, people's religious worship, religious practices. This so-called Establishment Clause, you may have heard that term at some point. The Establishment Clause of Amendment number 1 was based upon a lingering fear, a fear of potential government tyranny. Remember what we're talking about. We're talking about people who had just fought a revolution to win their independence from Great Britain, from a government they felt was tyrannical, dictatorial, did not respect their rights as citizens. We'd gained our independence. And in the first years of that new government of the United States, the states had reigned supreme in the governing document we had at that time called the Articles of Confederation. But the Articles of Confederation, it was soon determined, were not adequate to hold this union together. So a new document was produced, the Constitution of the United States. The preamble begins, we the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. That was the whole idea, to bring the states together in a better way, a more perfect way. But more and more voices were heard to affirm that religious practices were a matter of conscience and therefore should be exempt from interference or from laws made by any level of government, national, state, or local, because there was a fear of the imposition of government upon religious practices. The framers of the Constitution were well aware that any attempt to establish one government-sanctioned body, one government-sanctioned or supported religious body, would have been met with strong and possibly even violent protest from the adherents of different religious groups. To establish a government church, one that you must attend, one that you must support, they knew that that could not be. That's what England had done. That's what they got away from. So we're not going to have that. But on the other hand, they also realized that to deny the importance of religion in people's lives or the life of the nation would have deeply offended substantial numbers of people as much as having that single church would. Now, the Philadelphia Assembly avoided the issue. They did not deal with it directly. That's what the First Amendment did. In the nation at large, religious practice was so much a part of life. It was simply assumed that laws regarding things like sales on Sunday, that's gone out of the way, hasn't it? I can still remember the so-called blue laws, maybe you can too, where you could not transact business on a Sunday except for those things that were necessities of life. Oh, for the good old days. Matters of public morality. Regular use of terminology by public officials in documents and speech related to God or religious matters was appropriate. There was no one who banned those things. There was no one, certainly not among our founding fathers, so-called, who felt that that was wrong, who felt that there was no place for that. The government should stay out of religious questions, yes. Those were matters for individuals to decide. But recognize the right of people individually as well as collectively to practice and uphold their own religious beliefs with no imposition upon them by government. If you want to worship a bologna sandwich on Thursday evening, that's your business. Now, there was one restriction there, and the United States Supreme Court has upheld this frequently. If I say in the name of freedom of religion, well, you know, my religion requires human sacrifice. Therefore, as freedom of religion, you can't stop me from performing human sacrifice. Oh, yes, they can. Because that violates other laws, and you cannot do that. You cannot claim a religious right if it violates other laws and say, well, this is just practicing my religion. No, that won't work. The Supreme Court, as I said, has decided cases like that over and over again. They even did so in the case of polygamy. You can't claim that right and say it's okay just because it's our religion. They disallowed that in a case back in 1891. The third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, addressed in a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association in the year 1802, while he was president, made a statement in that letter, said there's a wall of separation between church and state. Here's the crux of the matter, folks. Here's what is misconstrued, here's what's misinterpreted, here's what's misused. What Jefferson said had nothing to do with taking religion out of public life. Now, Jefferson was not an overly religious man. I think we have to understand that. As a matter of fact, Jefferson was one of the authors of the Virginia Statutes of Religious Freedom. And he was very proud of that. He was not talking about, he was not referring to, he was not even hinting at the fact that there should be no connection whatsoever between government and quote-unquote religion. That's not what Jefferson meant. What he meant was there should not be an establishment of religion following the Bill of Rights, following the First Amendment, the establishment of a government-sponsored church. There is a wall of separation between the government and the church in that regard. While there could be no government-supported church, there could be government support for the concepts of Christianity or other religious practices. On the matter of church and state, the early leaders in the nation generally agreed. We're talking about people like Madison, who's considered the father of the U.S. Constitution, Washington, Monroe, Jefferson himself, John Adams. They generally agreed on some basic principles. The First Amendment did not prohibit religiously based arguments or religious values from being considered a part of public policies and laws. They have always been so. It did not prohibit that, does not prohibit that. The First Amendment did not exclude benefits from going to religious institutions from government sources if they were designed to help citizens of all backgrounds. We see it here in this community, you see it everywhere. There are buses that run every weekday, every school day. There are buses from Perry Township, Jackson Township, Canton City, you name it. They run to one of the parochial schools in this area. Well, is that not government supporting some particular religion? No, it's government benefiting individuals who need the bus transportation. That's the way the courts have ruled. There is not a prohibition against that. If it's designed to benefit citizens of all backgrounds without discrimination, it's permissible. Number three, the First Amendment does disallow government favoring or supporting with public funds, tax money, any particular church. That's the separation of church and state. Number three, that's what the Establishment Clause means. There is no ban, never has been, nor should there be any ban on all reference to or connection between government and religion. That's in the minds of certain individuals. That's part of the government's relationship to its citizens. We need to understand that. There are people who will very vocally tell you something else. Government can have nothing to do with religion. You can't have, in any public place, you can't have any connection with religion. You can't have anything that smacks of Christianity, Judaism, you name it. That was never the intent of the First Amendment. It was never designed that way. It was designed to limit what the government could do in relation to people who wanted to practice their religion. Alexander Campbell, one of the great leaders of the Restoration Movement, said about July 4th, 1776, "A day to be remembered. This revolution, taken in all of its influences, will make men free indeed." And that's what we have always desired to have. Individual and collective freedom within the context of the authority of government. But government has an obligation to us as citizens to preserve, protect, and defend, as the oath of the President of the United States in the Constitution says, our culture, our society, our laws. As Christians, we must help to preserve our political freedom. We need to be participating in the political process. I said at the very beginning of last week's lesson, this is not a political statement. I don't intend it to be. I don't want it to be. This is not the place for it. But it is a place to say that as citizens of the United States, we need to participate in our democratic process. We have a right to do that. We have an obligation to do that. It's an obligation just like paying our taxes. We also have to value our spiritual freedom in Christ. And so as we participate in the political process, we have to understand that we have an obligation to God as well, to uphold that which is right in His sight, to act upon the basis of our conscience. And there is a limit to what government can demand of us if it violates the Word and the will of God. This morning, if you've never obeyed the gospel of Jesus Christ, never become a part of His spiritual kingdom, never taken out your citizenship in that kingdom that shall never be destroyed, we invite you to do that by confessing Jesus as your Savior, by indicating your desire to turn from sin and turn to God, by being immersed, baptized for the forgiveness of your sins. Maybe you have other reasons for coming. We invite you and encourage you to do so. There'll be those here to receive you as we stand and as we sing.
Hello, my name is Lance Lindenberger, and I'm the pulpit minister with the Northwest Church of Christ in Canton, Ohio. We feel at Northwest we have much to offer, and we certainly, first of all, offer you a warm welcome. We want you to come and visit us. We want you to come and be a part of our services and our Bible study. But we also have activities for all ages. I think you'll find as you come to Northwest that you'll receive, first of all, a very cordial welcome. The people here are very friendly, and they want to welcome visitors, and they want to welcome those who come and explore what the church is all about and what we at Northwest are all about. Also, we have activities for all ages, and certainly for the youngest to the oldest, we have things that will appeal to people. We have things that you can do. It's not just worship and Bible study. There are activities for our children, beginning really with nursery age, and then right on through to our senior citizens. We're especially proud of our senior citizen program, the Golden Agers. They do a lot together. They have meals together, they have Bible study together, we travel to different places. It's quite an experience, and it's quite a fellowship for all those who participate. We'd like you to be a part of the experience at Northwest. Come and visit us at any time. We're located on 38th Street Northwest in Canton, Ohio, and we'd like to see you.